Hey guys, today we're going to be talking about real numbers and just the relationships between different types of numbers. So a rational number is a number that can be written as the ratio of two integers, and we're going to call those integers A and B. Where A and B are integers that do not equal 0. Okay, so they are whole numbers. They could be positive or negative, but they just can't equal 0. So a ratio, rational number just needs to be able to be written as a ratio of two integers. Okay, so under rational numbers, there are different types of numbers that we will get into more detail about. So the first one that we're going to talk about are natural numbers. So natural numbers are also known as counting numbers. Okay, so like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Those are all natural numbers. So beneath that we have whole numbers. And whole numbers are natural numbers and 0. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Those are all examples of whole numbers. Then we get into integers, which we should be very familiar with integers at this point because integers are whole numbers and their opposites. So an example would be like 1 and -1. Those are integers. Down beneath that we have terminating decimals. So a terminating decimal is a decimal whose digits end. So any decimal that comes to an end would be a terminating decimal. So 0.5 is a terminating decimal. And then there are also repeating decimals. And a repeating decimal, you can tell based upon the name, is a decimal whose digits repeat in groups of 1 or more. So there are patterns associated with it, and it's not repeating it definitely has a pattern. So we will also be talking about square roots later on. So the square root of any number that is a perfect square is also, that would be a whole number, but those are also rational numbers as well. Irrational numbers is a number that can't be written as the ratio of two integers. So examples of irrational numbers would be decimals that neither terminate nor repeat, or the square root of a number that is not a perfect square. So if you try to take the square root of 5, 5 is not a perfect square, it's going to give you an irrational answer. Okay, so down at the bottom, we are going to classify some numbers and do some examples. So what we are going to do for this part is we're going to talk about the two large groups first and then work our way down to more specific numbers in the middle. So the two larger groups of numbers that we've talked about so far are rational numbers and irrational numbers. So an example of a rational number, we could have the decimal 1.54 repeating. It's a repeating decimal, but 54 repeats. So it would be 1.54, 54, 54, repeating on and on and on. That's an example of a repeating decimal. We could have a terminating decimal, 1 67/100, or 1.67. We could have a negative fraction, -1/2. That's an example of a rational number. We could have 1/3. Those are all examples of rational numbers. So once again, rational numbers have to be able to be written as a ratio of two integers. So notice how neither one of those are 0 This, when you would divide the numerator, you could change both of these into fractions, and when you divide, you would get these decimals. Irrational numbers, on the other hand, would be things like pi. So pi is a decimal that repeats on and on and on forever, but there is no pattern associated with pi. Another example would be the square root of 3. 3 is not a perfect square, so if you type that in your calculator, you would get a decimal that never ends, but it doesn't repeat in any given pattern. Another example would be the decimal 1.6789. If it just went on and on with a bunch of random numbers, it would be an example of an irrational number. So irrational numbers repeat with no type of pattern associated with it. So down beneath rational numbers, we're going to talk about integers, which we should be pros on by now. So integers would be positive or negative whole numbers, so a number and its opposite. So -7 would be an example of an integer. If we wrote -8 halves, that would reduce to -4. That's an example of an integer. Beneath integers, we have whole numbers. So whole numbers include 0, and any positive number associated with that. And then when we get even more specific, we'll talk about natural numbers. So natural numbers would be like 57, the square root of 16, which is 4. So any counting number, positive counting number, would be an example of a natural number. So please make sure that you get this down in your notes, and we will talk about this more in class tomorrow. Thanks.